Good morning, Gertens gardeners. This is Karen, and I'm coming to you from our nursery lot, our north lot this morning. A little break in the storm, and we're glad to have you with us this morning. Today we're going to be talking about water plants, and more specifically, everybody's favorite kinds, the water lilies and water lotus. Now, these are our most popular plants with our shoppers, and for good reason, because they provide you with summer-long blooms throughout your water feature, and you can grow them not just in a pond this size, which is a beautiful feature, but also in small deck containers or patio containers. So whether you're growing in something like this or you're growing in something like this, you can enjoy the beauty of water lilies and water lotus. We're going to be taking your questions this morning, so please feel free to chime in. We will also be watching the feed, so if you miss me this morning, please feel free to put your questions down below. We will be checking back in with you and getting back to you with those questions. Let's get started.
So Karen, our first question is, what is the difference between water lilies and lotus?
All right, so today we have a really good example of the difference between water lilies and water lotus. And let's take a look. We're going to bring the camera right on over to our pond here, and we're going to look at three plants. Here we have a tropical water lily. Now this is Juno, and Juno is a night blooming water lily. It's just getting ready to close for the morning. We have albatross, which is, as you can see, a much smaller plant, and this is a hardy water lily. And then we have pink parfait, and this is a lotus. And you can see when it comes to getting started for the year, we have a big range of differences between these three plants. Now, of course, our water lilies do come to us from a far milder climate, but lotus in the springtime take a really long time to get going. So water lilies live on the surface of the pond or the water feature. They're planted below the water, and then they come up and they lay flat against the water surface. With lotus, you can already see it starting to do its thing here. They are also grown below the water surface, but they have their leaves, and their leaves pop up above the water. So the lotus is actually going to grow above the water, and it's going to stand up, and it's going to flower way above the water surface. So that is a primary difference between these. Also, the water lilies, you're probably going to have flowers in June. With lotus, don't expect anything resembling flowers until at least after 4th of July.
Our second question is tropical versus hardy. What are the big differences?
So what are the differences between a tropical water lily and a hardy water lily? Well, number one, it's obvious in the name. One lives in the tropics and one lives here in cold weather climates. So with these two water lilies, you can see Juno is a tropical water lily. It has huge leaves. The leaves are heavily serrated, very big and flat. They don't have much of a V at the back, and they have something of a V on the back end, and the flowers can get absolutely massive. With a hardy water lily, generally the spread on a hardy water lily is going to be much smaller, about 3 to 5 feet on average, although certainly there are some that can get bigger than that, up to 12 feet, whereas with tropicals you can get up to 20 feet. The leaves themselves are quite a bit smaller, and I'm just going to have the camera pan down a little bit to look at a couple of these leaves. We've got some more differences between tropical and hardy water lilies right here for you. So here we have Queen of Siam, and you can tell the stunning striation on the leaves here. Beautiful. This is a tropical water lily. Again, larger leaves, really, really bright colors on the leaves. And right next to it we have, this is Patio Joe. This is actually one I have at home. I love Patio Joe. And you can see this is also a water lily that, unlike Juno and albatross, does have some mottling, but it's very subtle. It's not nearly as obvious as it is on Queen of Siam. The leaves are much, much smaller, and you do have some of that mottling, but it's not like a painter splashed the leaves, right? It's very subtle. So you get mottling in both types, and in fact here with red flare you can see this is another tropical water lily, stunning red leaves. Just what a gorgeous plant. And this plant has bright, bright red flowers as well. Beautiful. But the tropicals are very splashy. They're very big. They don't like cold weather. The hardy water lily is a little bit more reserved, a little bit more prim and proper, but they love the winters. They get through the winters just fine. You don't have to bring them inside if you keep your pond open or if you have a deep feature. that goes down to 3 feet where the frost line stops. Okay, so you can actually leave these in the pond. Tropicals absolutely have to be out of the pond by probably late September, as those nighttime temperatures are dipping below 40.
So you touched on it a little, but in Minnesota, we can have tropical water lilies. Do you have any tips or tricks for overwintering them?
Yeah, so I love tropical water lilies, and it's $65 a piece here at Gertens. They are a little bit of an investment, and certainly an investment that you want to try to keep alive year to year. And certainly the longer you keep it, the bigger the plant, which means it's going to grow over time. But how do we achieve that? Well, in Minnesota, you want to make sure that a tropical water lily is out of the pond before the water temperatures drop below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, luckily, water temperatures, especially in larger systems, tend to be fairly stable through the autumn. So keep your pond thermometer in there, keep an eye on the temperatures. And when you start to see those water temperatures getting close to 50 degrees, it's time to pull your water lily out. What I recommend doing is cutting off all of the leaves and the buds. You can take some buds if they still are colored up, and you can enjoy them in a vase, which is wonderful. And then take your water lily, put it in a bucket, and throw it down in the basement. So unlike with hardy water lilies, which probably can go in the garage, they can kind of survive those colder temperatures. If these rhizomes get to freezing, they will die. So you do not want to throw this in the garage. You do not want to throw this in the shed unless you're one of those lucky folks who has a heated garage, and you're okay. But down in the basement, keep it wet, and then as the pond temperatures begin to climb again in May, you can set it back outside. It'll grow and bloom for you again next summer.
One question we have from the audience is, when should I expect my lotus to start to bloom?
When should you expect your lotus to start to bloom? When you look at this little bucket here, it sure doesn't look like much right now, does it? But I can guarantee you that if you were to come back and look at this in July, it's going to look like an entirely different plant. And that's because lotus take their sweet time growing from their tubers. So I'm going to gently kind of lift this out so you can see what a tuber looks like. Here is the entirety of the plant. You can just see the roots starting to form down here, and I'm not hurting it. I'm being very gentle. Here's your growth tip. You can see the new roots are growing here. Here's another growth tip. And what we do is we just plant it in a little furrow in a mixture of, I do potting mix, actually topsoil, because they like a little bit heavier soil, and then I top that with sand. And they like a warm water temperature, and they don't like to be in much water when they're starting out. So you want to keep them in a system like this until you see big leaves standing about this high out of your tub. That means that the water lotus is ready to go into a water feature for the season. After that, it takes about a month. So from the time that you get the big standing leaves to when they begin to produce their buds, it's about a month. Here in Minnesota, that's typically July. Right around the 4th of July is when you will begin to see those flowers. And this is kind of an experience that everybody in Minnesota has been having with their lotus as they're reporting back to me. They're saying, yeah, I've been seeing, this is the growth that it looks like this time of year. I've been getting my flowers in July. So that kind of for our climate is typical. Now, if you're one of those lucky folks who happen to have a greenhouse at home and it's heated, it stays warm, you can actually start your lotus a little bit earlier, like we talked about back in February, March, and that will get you some flowers more like June.
Talking about care tips, what do you use to feed water lilies or locusts?
Right, so with water lilies and lotus, they're both very heavy feeders. They're kind of like the roses of the water feature world, which means that they eat a lot, more than your fish can poop out. I have a lot of people who are like, oh, I have fish in my system. The fish poop. Isn't that enough fertilizer? If, excuse me, if you're talking about like your reeds and your grasses, yeah, that's great fertilizer for your reeds and grasses. They'll take that fish poop and they'll convert it into their own source of fuel, and they'll grow like crazy. But when you're talking about flowering plants, they actually need direct fertilizer right at the root system, not in the water column, because their roots are not really good at taking nutrition out of the water column like roots of grasses and reeds are. So they actually want a direct fertilizer right into the tub. You can use a spike or a tab, and I tell folks 2 tabs per pot per month. So if you were to buy this lotus or this water lily today, I would be selling you a bag of tabs, and you put 1 on each side of your pot. So I just dig a little hole with my finger. You put the tab right in the little hole. You cover it back up again, and that's good to go for the month. Then pull your water lily or lotus back out. Do it again in July. do it again in August, and you're going to enjoy a summer full of the most magnificent blooms.
And the final question we have for now is, how much sun do these need?
How much sun? So that's an excellent question. Now, obviously, with tropical water lilies, they come from the tropics. And what is there in the tropics? Just a ton of sunshine, right? So these guys, not shade tolerant at all. They must have 8 hours of sun to successfully grow and flower. With hardy water lilies, they grow in places like Minnesota, and we know in Minnesota we do have lots of trees on the shoreline. And yes, of course, directly out in the lake you get direct sun, but not always next to the shoreline where the lilies are growing. So some of our hardy water lilies are a little bit more shade tolerant, which means that they can take 6 hours of sunshine a day and still bloom and grow beautifully for you. Be sure to talk to my staff out here at Water Gardens. We're here all weekend. And ask us which are the best varietals for shade, because there are some that are more shade tolerant and will do really well for you. And there are some that are a little bit more like the tropical water lilies and just want to be in the sunshine.
Any final tips or tricks that you have?
Yeah, so when I always talk to folks about water lilies, the number one thing that you want to know, excuse me, is you have stuff like this, right? The leaf is kind of falling apart and the leaf stock has started to degrade. And everybody asks me, Karen, isn't that sick? Is it normal? And yes, it is. Water lilies go through their leaves. Their leaves only last about 10 days per leaf. So when you look at a water lily in your pond, you're going to see a lot of broken and decaying leaves. That is totally normal. Your water lily isn't sick. It's just doing what it naturally does, because if you live in a system with a lot of water, you're probably living with fish, and you're living with a lot of other creatures that are nibbling on your leaves. And the best way to deal with that is just to make a bunch of them. That way, if a fish comes along and grabs one of your leaves and chomps on it, you have plenty more where that came from, right? And you're able to produce more over time. So water lilies turn over their leaves very, very frequently. With Lotus, it's mostly a game of patience. It doesn't look like much right now, but give it a month and it will be spectacular. So just really be patient. Keep it out in tons of sun. Keep it in its shallow water bucket for about a month. And then when it's ready to go, especially if you have a big lotus like this one here, this is actually pink parfait, but we do sell some that are 4 to 5 feet tall, almost as tall as a person. Make sure that when you've got those standing leaves, you replant it into a lotus bucket like this. And this is going to give that lotus enough room to kind of spread out, really make a great show without getting into the pond and causing a bunch of trouble. Because as you can see, the little lotuses they're going to branch out through this entire tub. And if you were to plant it directly in your pond, it's going to branch out through the whole pond and make just an absolute mess. So make sure that unlike water lilies, you do not plant them directly. Keep them in their tubs so that you can enjoy them and they don't cause mess. All right, you guys, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Again, we'll be keeping a watch on the feed. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm so excited to be interacting with you, and I hope you have a spectacular Gertens Gardener Day.